In order to understand the main topic, which is the brain in its needs, we need to move to the next level, the macrostructural level, and recall the anatomy of the brain. This material is included in the school curriculum. However, since not every adult remembers what they once heard at school, let us briefly review the structure of the central nervous system. Especially relevant for us are knowledge about the hypothalamus, the basal ganglia, the midbrain, and the cerebral cortex. The central nervous system, abbreviated as the CNS, is the brain plus the spinal cord. They are located respectively inside the skull and inside the vertebral column. I assume this is already known to you. The structure of the spinal cord, in comparison with the brain, is significantly simpler. Therefore, let us first examine the spinal cord. Just as our body, from the neck to the coccyx, is divided into 31 levels, yes, levels like a high rise building, so the spinal cord is divided into 31 segments, each of which roughly corresponds to one vertebra. This segmentation is determined by special genes that switch on at a very early stage of embryonic development, already during the first weeks of pregnancy. Each segment of the spinal cord works with its own level of the body. It receives skin and pain sensitivity, signals from joints and tendons, and controls muscles and internal organs. In this respect, we are quite similar to an earthworm or to a butterfly caterpillar. Remember the rings along their bodies. In a caterpillar, the segments are very clearly expressed, whereas in us, although they are not visible, they nevertheless exist. There are 8 cervical segments, 12 thoracic segments, 5 lumbar segments, and 6 sacral and coccygeal segments. These correspond respectively to the neck, the arms, and breathing, the organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavities, the trunk muscles, the legs, and the pelvic region. If, for example, the sixth thoracic vertebra shifts relative to the seventh, it may compress the nerves that exit from the 6 thoracic segments of the spinal cord. And then nothing good awaits the person. They will feel pain somewhere in the area of the ribs, and this will not be connected with any actual damage or injury, but with the fact that the spinal cord is transmitting signals poorly. In addition, the functioning of the heart or the intestines may worsen. When doctors say that half of all illnesses come from the spine, they are right because the transmission of information to and from the spinal cord is disrupted quite easily. For example, if the vertebrae shift sideways due to scoliosis, which is far from uncommon with a sedentary lifestyle, there is a possibility that they will press on a branch of some nerve. We are upright creatures, but over the several million years that have passed since our ancestors stood up on two legs, the spine has never fully adapted to the fact that its unusual owner stands and walks vertically. Therefore, by the age of 40, most people already have back pain. Each segment of the spinal cord works with its own level of the body. It also communicates with the chief authority, the brain. There are information pathways that connect the palm with the cervical segments of the spinal cord, and from there, this information goes to headquarters, to the brain. If we feel that, for example, something is crawling on the thumb of our hand, this means that the impulse first reached the spinal cord, then ascended to the cerebral cortex, where the higher mental centers are located. They are precisely the ones responsible for the emergence of sensation. If a person understands that a spider is crawling on them and shakes it off their palm, this means that the process has gone in the opposite direction. The impulse first arose in the cerebral cortex, descended to the corresponding segment of the spinal cord, and from there traveled along the axon of a motor neuron to the necessary muscle. The neuromuscular synapse caused it to contract. The spider will have to look for another place to crawl. In an adult, such reactions occur quite quickly and automatically, because we learn this during the first years of our life. A child, however, is born almost without motor skills, although some of them begin to be established even in the mother's womb. In the first months of life, an infant spends a great deal of effort mastering their muscular system at the level of individual movements. They try to understand how to hold up their head, how to roll on their stomach, how to grasp their parents' hair more firmly. Only around 6 months of age do they begin refining locomotor activity, gradually crawling and attempting to walk. Now let's take a look at the brain. Three main regions of the brain can be distinguished: the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebral hemispheres. The brainstem is the central region of the brain, a very ancient structure that already exists in fish. Its evolutionary age is apparently no less than 500 million years. From the brainstem, like from the trunk of some mutant tree, two crowns grow. One crown is larger. These are the hemispheres, the cerebral hemispheres. And the other is smaller. This is the cerebellum, that is the little brain. In all vertebrates, the brain is organized according to the same general plan. We are all relatives, and the intensive evolution of mammals took place during the last 66 million years after the extinction of the dinosaurs. In humans, as is well known, the brain is not the largest in the world. In an elephant or a sperm whale, it is several times heavier. If a creature is large, with a massive body, then a large brain is also needed to control that bulk. But it is mainly engaged in regulating internal organs, movements, and skin sensitivity, catching a squid, brushing away a fly. Higher associative areas, however, are unique to the human brain. Only in humans are they so large. That is why an elephant cannot write poetry or invent how it will celebrate the new year. A human can. The brainstem includes four divisions. The first two are the medulla oblongata and the pons. These are the two lowest brainstem structures. They are located beneath the cerebellum. The midbrain lies above them, and the final division is the diencephalon. It means intermediate, and it is called that way because it is located between the hemispheres. From it, during embryonic development, two large hemispheres grow to the right and to the left. They are also called the telencephalon, which means the final brain. Altogether, this gives six major divisions of the brain. There are two large internal cavities, the third and the fourth ventricles, and the canal connecting these cavities, the cerebral aqueduct. We will consistently consider the medulla oblongata and the pons together because, from a functional point of view, they form a single unit. Together, they are responsible for the most essential functions of the body, breathing, and the work of the heart. The cerebellum is a crucial motor center. Among other things, it is responsible for our balance, walking, running, and other motor skills. The midbrain is located between the pons and the diencephalon. The upper part of the diencephalon is called the thalamus, and the lower part is the hypothalamus. Beneath the hypothalamus lies the pituitary endocrine glands. Here, in the diencephalon, there is also a second endocrine gland called the pineal gland. If you're feeling confused, don't worry, because we will sort it out. The largest region of the human central nervous system is the cerebral hemispheres. The right and left hemispheres are connected by the largest bundle of axons, called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a massive tract of nerve fibers that links the two hemispheres and allows them to exchange information. It integrates the hemispheres into a single computational complex. If the corpus callosum is damaged, a person may develop symptoms resembling a split personality when the hemispheres begin to function separately. The right hemisphere initiates one set of movements, and the left initiates another. Coordination and motor control are disrupted, and sensations on the right and left sides of the body become desynchronized. We will go from the bottom to the top and explore everything in more details. So let's start with medulla oblongata and bones. We already mentioned that they are responsible for vital functions. Without these functions, it is simply impossible to exist. It is clear that these functions are evolutionarily the most ancient. Everything began with them. For example, even in a shark, these divisions are organized approximately the same way as in humans. First of all, this is where the headquarters for controlling breathing is located. Every inhalation and exhalation is initiated in the medulla oblongata in the pons. Second, this area contains the center that neurophysiologists call the vasomotor center. It consists of neurons that regulate the work of the heart, vascular tone, and the entire cardiovascular system. This is a vast domain through which, for example, blood flow in different parts of the body and blood pressure are regulated. Managing these processes is a vital task. Third, everything connected with innate feeding behavior is based here. Taste centers, centers that initiate swallowing, salivation, the sucking reflex, spitting, vomiting, everything that's in an infant must function immediately. Otherwise, the child will not be able to feed. Fourth, the medulla oblongata and the pons contain the main center of wakefulness. This headquarters gathers signals from all sensory systems and returns a person from the world of dreams if, for example, an alarm clock rings or someone shakes their shoulder. Any strong incoming sensory signal is capable of awakening the brain. After that, from the medulla oblongata in the pons, waves of activation spread throughout the entire central nervous system, from the spinal cord to the cerebral cortex, and we shift from a sleepy state to a wakeful one. If this zone is damaged, a coma will occur. Any damage to the medulla oblongata in the bones, even the slightest and microscopic, is life-threatening because breathing may stop or the ability to swallow properly may be impaired. Above the medulla oblongata in the bones lies the cerebellum. The cerebellum is, first and foremost, a motor center. The movements of our body are extremely diverse. If we wish, we can voluntarily move an arm, a leg, or the head. There are movements associated with moving through space. They are called locomotion. For example, running or walking. Reflex movements are also distinguished when, for example, we withdraw our palm from a hot pot. The cerebellum is responsible only for automated movements. That is, for those movements with which we initially could not cope clearly and efficiently because they were new to us, but which we repeated again and again and eventually learned. Riding with a pencil or riding a bicycle, it is at the level of the cerebellum that such motor programs are memorized and automated. When we repeat the same actions over and over, the neurons of the cerebellum remember how to perform them quickly and accurately. Repetition is the mother of learning. You know the saying. While we are learning, such movements are mainly controlled by the cerebral cortex. It carries out voluntary control. At first, you must look at how you place your feet on the bicycle pedals, where you steer the handlebars, monitor every turn of the wheel, watch the road, and at the same time remember about balance. But if you repeat all these manipulations 100 or 1000 times, motor automatism arises. Then it is no longer the cerebral cortex that controls the movements of the arms and legs, but the cerebellum. The cerebellum pedals and turns the handlebars, while the cerebral cortex, at the moment, for example, listens to an audiobook. The meaning of automation is to relieve the cerebral hemispheres and to transfer routine movements, those that are repeated often and many times, under the control of the cerebellum. Simply put, not to think where it is possible not to think. In the cerebellum, there are several zones that deal with different types of movements. There is a central part, the vermis. It is responsible for maintaining balance. This is the automation of vestibular reflexes. Its training begins from the moment when a child starts holding up the head, learns to sit, and in general tries in every possible way to make friends with gravity. The middle zone of the cerebellum, the inner part of the hemispheres, is responsible for the automation of locomotion and develops when we begin to crawl, walk, run, swim, that is, move through space by rhythmically bending our arms and legs, like a locomotive pulling carriages from point A to point B. The outer part of the cerebellum, the outer region of the hemispheres, is often called the new part because evolutionarily it appeared later than the others. It is responsible for movements that, in a developed form, are characteristic only of humans. Fine motor skills of the fingers and speech. We do spend a long and difficult time learning to speak, gradually mastering phonemes and words. We also spend a long time figuring out how to write, how to play a musical instrument, or how to shape dumplings. All these are purely human skills, and our progress with them is slower. The cerebellum is involved in the automation of many different movements, and if something in it breaks down, a habitual action becomes voluntary again. After a cerebellar injury, one has to maintain balance by an effort of will and consciously bend and straighten the legs while walking. That is, contrary to popular belief, it is indeed possible to forget how to ride a bicycle and even more. In addition to the cerebellum, the automation of movements is also handled by another extensive zone of our brain, which is called the basal ganglia. They are located deep within the cerebral hemispheres. We know that the outer surface of the cerebral hemispheres is occupied by the cortex. These are entire layers of neurons running parallel to the surface of the brain and performing the most important and complex functions: sensory analysis, that is, the perception of touch, smells, and so on, speech, decision making, and voluntary movements. That is, those that we consciously control, for example, hammering a nail or pressing buttons. Deep within the cerebral hemispheres, there are several clusters of gray matter. Together, they form an integrated complex called the basal ganglia. The main part of their neurons work together with the cerebellum, consolidating repeated motor programs and patterns. That is, if the cerebellum, for example, memorizes individual movements of a dance, then the basal ganglia automate the transition from one figure to another and remember the dance as a whole. Now, let us examine the midbrain. In its upper part, there is the so called quadrigeminal plate. This is the region that responds to the novelty of stimuli. Its neurons single out new visual and auditory signals. Strictly speaking, the quadrigeminal plate does not care what exactly we see or hear. What matters is that a change has occurred. It is this structure that detects novelty and makes us turn our heads if something rustles in the bushes or if someone shouts nearby. Thanks to the quadrigeminal plate, our organism effectively gathers new information. In essence, curiosity at its most ancient level is connected with it. Like, yeah, what exactly is rustling in the bushes? That kind of things. In the center of the midbrain, there is a structure called the central gray matter. This is the main area that initiates sleep. If you remember, Our main wakefulness center is located in the pons and the medulla oblongata, whereas the sleep center is in the midbrain. These two constantly compete with each other. Depending on which one wins, we move into either a sleepy or a wakeful state. If neither gains the laurels of victory, we find ourselves in a kind of half drowsy condition, especially in the morning or during monotonous and boring activity. You are surely familiar with this. In the lower part of the midbrain are the red nucleus and the substantia nigra. These are two structures that are also connected with the motor sphere. The red nucleus works together with the cerebellum and helps, for example, to bend the arms and legs when we run or walk somewhere. The substantia nigra carries out its functions together with basal ganglia, largely determining the overall level of our motor activity. Moreover, all the positive emotions that we experience when we move depend on it. If from birth you were given an active substantia nigra, you most likely enjoy moving, walking, exercising, dancing. It may seem that dancing does not bring any useful results, yet a person still dances and feels joy. The substantia nigra is responsible for this. However, there is also a competing program in our brain, the program of laziness, which says that we should not move, that we should conserve energy. The balance between the joy of movement and laziness is individual and depends on genes and hormones. For some people, the suggestion to go for a run in the park on a Sunday is wonderful. Someone else will grumble, "No, I feel good on a couch." But this already belongs to the sphere of specific personality traits, which in this case are largely connected with the substantia nigra and with the neurotransmitter called dopamine. Next one is diencephalon, intermediate brain. The diencephalon is first and foremost the thalamus and the hypothalamus. These are, respectively, the upper and lower parts of this division of the central nervous system. The size of each of them is about 4 centimeters. These are very important structures, and they can also be seen in anatomical diagrams. The thalamus is a region that primarily works with sensory signals. It is responsible for what we call attention. If you concentrate, for example, on someone's lecture or on a story about their vacation, this means that your thalamus is mainly allowing auditory signals to pass through. If at that moment your right heel suddenly begins to itch and you turn your attention to it, at that moment the thalamus begins to transmit signals of skin sensitivity. At the same time, auditory sensitivity is very strongly inhibited because the cerebral cortex cannot fully process everything at once. So, while you are enthusiastically stretching your heel, the details of your conversation partner's excursion through some ruined fortress will pass you by. More precisely, they will pass by the higher auditory centers of the temporal region. We really need the thalamus, so because the cerebral cortex cannot simultaneously see, hear, touch, smell, recall your previous vacation, and at the same time reflect on the emotions associated with that vacation. One could go crazy that way. The thalamus is our indispensable secretary who helps redistribute the computational resources of the cerebral cortex and prevents our boss, which is the cerebral cortex itself, that is our higher centers, ourselves, from being overloaded with a multitude of tasks at the same time. The hypothalamus is the most important center of biological needs, the center of endocrine and autonomic regulation. It monitors the secretion of hormones and controls the functioning of internal organs. For example, during stress, it is precisely the hypothalamus that is responsible for the fact that when we are anxious, our sweating increases and our blood pressure rises. Here in the hypothalamus, there is also a group of neurons that deal with tasks from the sphere of needs, motivation, and emotions. Hunger, thirst, fear, aggression, sexual behavior, parental behavior, all these are associated with the hypothalamus. These are the big six biological needs, and we will devote a separate chapter to each of them. Now let's finally take a look at the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is divided into ancient, old, and new cortex. The ancient cortex is the olfactory cortex. Evolutionarily, it appeared earlier than the others, and it was already present in fish at a time when life on Earth had not yet left the waters of the seas and oceans. It turns out that the cerebral hemispheres arose in order to smell, and nature considered this their primary task. They are located closest to the nasal cavity. In fish, the cortex is mainly responsible for olfaction, whereas in humans, it uses only about 2% of its total capacity for this purpose. The ancient cortex includes the olfactory bulb and certain areas located on the inner surface of the cerebral hemispheres near the anterior part of the corpus callosum. Over the course of evolution, the cerebral hemispheres gradually began to take on other tasks. Such an ingenious structure could be adapted for additional purposes. Therefore, already at the level of amphibians and reptiles, the invertebrates moved onto land, another form of cortex clearly developed, the alt cortex. The alt cortex is first and foremost associated with short term memory. Of course, there is also much to remember in the ocean. For example, coral reef fish know their territory very well. But on land, such tasks become much more extensive, and so the alt cortex became more distinctly developed. Its main center is hippocampus. It is located deep in the temporal lobe, at the bottom of a special hippocampal sulcus. However, the main part, more than 95% of our cortex, is the neocortex, which is characteristic of mammals. It includes sensory, motor, and associative areas. They are also called higher cortical areas. The neocortex is divided into six lobes. Four of them are probably familiar to you: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. In addition to these, the insular lobe and the limbic lobe of the cerebral hemispheres are also distinguished. If we look at this entire structure from the side, the frontal lobe is located at the front. Its boundary is the central sulcus. behind which lies the parietal region. The most posterior position is occupied by the occipital lobe. The lowest position is taken by the temporal lobe, which is separated from the rest of the brain by a deep lateral sulcus. The bottom of this sulcus forms an impressive expansion. This is the insular lobe. Finally, the limbic lobe is located on the inner surface of the hemispheres. The limbic region of the cortex surrounds the place where the hemispheres diverge from the encephalon. This lobe often includes the ancient olfactory cortex and the centers of short-term memory, that is the alt cortex. It's quite difficult to remember these entire sets, but it becomes easier when we look at what the lobes are actually responsible for and what they are doing. If we schematically describe the functions of the cerebral cortex, the picture will be as follows. There is the occipital lobe. It is the visual cortex. It is our video card, and it is located in the back part of the head. Therefore, if you hit the back of your head hard, I do not recommend it, but sparks may fly from your eyes. A visual illusion occurs. This is because during a blow, the occipital cortex is involuntarily stimulated. The temporal lobe is the auditory cortex, and this is easy to remember because the ears are on the sides near the temples. The anterior part of the parietal lobe runs from the crown of the head downward. This is the zone of bodily sensitivity, skin, pain, and muscle sensation. The insular lobe is a center of taste and also the center of vestibular sensitivity. The posterior part of the frontal lobe is the motor cortex. This is the zone that implements new voluntary movements when we are just learning to skateboard or to dance salsa. It is by orienting itself to the motor cortex that the cerebellum memorizes and automates our motor skills. So, how does the brain work? The associative parietal cortex is surrounded by the main sensory centers responsible for all the sensations we gather from the environment: what we see, what we hear, what touches we feel, whether our lunch tastes good. After sensory information has been processed, it is sent to the associative parietal cortex. In this region, there arises what in neuropsychology is called a holistic sensory image of the external world. Thanks to the associative parietal cortex, we simultaneously see, hear, feel. We do not switch from the visual channel to the auditory one and then to the tactile one. Otherwise, we would hardly be able to, for example, eat pizza while watching a TV series at the same time. Fortunately, we perceive everything at the same time. In the associative parietal cortex, there are neurons capable of working simultaneously with different sensory systems. It is on the basis of these neurons that speech centers arise in humans, because speech and words imply the presence of neural cells that interact at the same time with several sensory systems. For example, we set ourselves the goal of buying a table. We look at it in a furniture store. Vision is engaged. We say to the salesperson, I need a table. Hearing is engaged. It is precisely these neurons that integrate the visual and auditory signals. That is why in the associative parietal cortex we also have speech centers and centers of thinking. It turns out that this is the zone with which we think. No less important is the associative frontal cortex. We can reflect and dream about anything, and that is wonderful, but what ultimately matters is how we act. Our behavior, the selection of a program of action, and decision making are precisely the responsibility of the associative frontal cortex. Ideally, we should initiate a useful behavior that works in our favor, satisfies the needs of the organism, and helps us cope with difficulties. This is why information about needs arrives specifically in the associative frontal cortex. The hypothalamus sends its signals there first and foremost. For example, things like I'm hungry, I want to reproduce, I am afraid here, maybe it's time to get out of here. The associative frontal cortex, having received information about needs, turns to the memory centers, to individual experience, and to the associative parietal cortex with the question of what important things are happening in the surrounding world. After receiving these three streams of information, the associative frontal cortex makes a decision to initiate behavior or not. If you begin to feel uneasy in a pitch dark forest thicket, however you happen to end up there, you decide to leave. To do this, you need to stand up, start moving your legs, and head towards a more comfortable space. The signal from the associative frontal cortex goes to the motor cortex, which is conveniently located nearby, in the posterior part of the frontal lobe. That in turn sends signals to the cerebellum and the spinal cord. And we begin to move our arms and legs to take action and to make our way out of the wilderness. Roughly speaking, this is what the main information flows look like as they spread across our cerebral cortex when we do something. And we perform one action or another almost all the time. Within this system, needs play a very important initiating role. Their presence often serves as the stimulus that triggers behavior. Without needs, the brain and accordingly the body would simply lie sluggishly in place and undertake nothing. Whether by one's own will or against it, it would make no difference. Therefore, next time we will talk about needs.